We're fortunate, friends, to be joined today by the Reverend Marcus Halley. He's the Dean of Formation and Missioner in the Diocese of Connecticut, and joins us to explore and build up among us the foundations of the beloved community, our capacity to transform a stranger into a sibling, and to move from our perpetual quest for privilege to a posture and pursuit of equity for one another. A couple of household or housekeeping notes for us as we begin. Please make use of the chat feature in Zoom. Send out questions or thoughts. It's a great way for us to kind of connect behind the scenes, to whisper a thought to a neighbor, if you will, at a table. As always, we're going to continue the same structure as we've used in weeks past. We'll have a rich conversation with Marcus, inviting us to consider the practices that build up the beloved community. Marcus and I will have an opportunity to dive a little more deeply into that. And then we'll be joined at the end of our conversation by a couple of responders who will help, I pray, make this conversation personal, to move it from the head to the heart, if you will. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by John and Ebony Galuli and Rima Wah, who will help turn this important conversation into a personal conversation. But before we dive into things, let's pause for a moment and reflect on the kingdom and the kingdom to which God has called us all. Let us pray. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Friends, one final housekeeping note before I forget, and that is that this first portion of our conversation today will be recorded. All of these recordings are made so that friends of ours who can't be with us this morning are able to join us and reflect with us on these practices and these conversations. So they'll be posted on YouTube as well as Facebook Live, so that you also, of course, can go back to YouTube, find the Christ Church Grosse Pointe page, and revisit this conversation throughout this week. Again, friends, I'm delighted to introduce to all of you the Reverend Marcus Halley. He's the Dean of Formation and Missioner in the Diocese of Connecticut. Now, if that's not enough, he's also the priest-in-charge at the Church of the Holy Spirit in West Haven. And if that's not enough, he's also the author of Proclaim, Sharing Words, Living Examples, Changing Lives. Now, that's all functional stuff that tells us a lot about Marcus, but here's something I think that's even more valuable, his passion. Marcus shares a passion, I am fortunate to share a passion with him, for the formation of disciples, exploring what's our purpose, helping others to live the life God imagines for each of us to live. And so Marcus is deeply committed to the work of the church because God has work for us to do now, today, in this moment. Part of that work, of course, is to become the beloved community, to work to transform our hearts, in order that we can also transform our relationships, and in transforming our relationships, transform the world. I'm delighted to be joined by Marcus today. I look forward to our conversation together, and I hope that you all will enjoy it as much as I expect I will. And so with that, Marcus, I'm going to find the right screen again and turn it over to you, my friend. It's great to see you again. Thanks for joining us this morning. And let's dive into what it looks like to transform our relationships from strangers to siblings, and to transform our pursuits from privilege to equity. Marcus, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Drew. And good morning, everyone. It is a joy to be with you all. Just before this conversation began, there was a little bit of conversation about what folks are hoping for sort of on the other end of COVID tide. And I am looking forward to pizza parties. So my partner and I got a really fancy pizza oven for Christmas, with the hope that we can host all these sort of like pizza dinner parties. And that, I promise, connects to what we're going to be talking about today.
I'll be coming to West Haven.
So I came to the Episcopal Church 10 years ago after a series of what proved to be providential events. First, I had been forced to leave my childhood church after I realized that our ideas of human dignity for LGBTQ folks were too divergent to continue to walk together. That was even before I myself came out. I also managed to stumble across a live stream of the Episcopal Church in General Convention where the former presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts Shorey, was preaching from Luke's recounting of the sending of the 70 disciples about a church oriented towards the mission of God. And then I also found myself at the altar rail of St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I shared in the Eucharist. And then in that moment, felt that I had been swept up into something amazing. And so in many ways, I have spent the years of my life after that moment trying to find some way to understand and respond to that moment of grace. That might be why I wound up being ordained even after I resisted so much, because I've been trying to find out how can I respond to the amazing grace of God at work in my life. Trying to understand the question, what way of life have I just stepped into? What is the significance of any of this? How am I changed? How is the world different? And so fast forward a few years of living into ordained ministry in the church, and we began hearing this word again of the beloved community. Now, I heard this word many, many years ago when I was in seminary in Atlanta at the Interdenominational Theological Center, the largest historically Black seminary in this country. We had begun thinking about what it means to be beloved community in our own context in the world. What I've learned is that it is helpful to define what we mean by beloved community. It's one of those words that gets taken and used over and over again in ways that I don't think are super helpful or precise, rather. So I want to take some time to actually define what we mean when we say beloved community. According to the King Center, beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. Now, it is also helpful to understand what the beloved community is not. And specifically, the King Center says it is not a lofty utopian goal to be confused with the rapturous image of the peaceable kingdom in which lions and lambs coexist in idyllic harmony. Rather, the beloved community is a realistic, achievable goal that could be attained by a critical mass of people committed to and trained in the philosophy and methods of nonviolence. And you can find all of that information simply by going to the King Center website, just Googling beloved community and King Center, all that information will come up to you. But there's a couple of things in this definition that I think are worth exploring for our time together. First, the idea of the beloved community as global, as universal, as Catholic, if you will. This idea that this is a way of life that has to take root in people of varying ways of life, varying ethical, moral, and religious creeds. If we are to build the beloved community, in other words, it requires us to take a step out of our own boxes and to see how this kind of life is taking root in other communities, other peoples, other cultures as well. That requires a spirit of humility. It is also interesting when we look at this definition of beloved community, that beloved community is boundaried. It has boundaries to it. What that means is that while we like to pride ourselves as people of tolerance, there must be some things that we simply will not tolerate. To quote Dr. King from his sermon, Transformed Nonconformist, Dr. King says this: "There are some things in our world to which people of goodwill must be maladjusted. Human salvation," he says, "lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted." What are those things that the beloved community simply will not adjust to, will not accommodate? That is poverty, that is racism, that is militarism, that are all the things that are robbing human beings of their dignity, that the beloved community is boundary. There are simply things that we cannot tolerate, things that cannot exist within the beloved community. And finally, and there's more to this definition, but one of the things that I think that's helpful to think about is the beloved community is achievable. So while the fullness of the kingdom of God is out of human control, thanks be to God, we do have the ability, in fact, friends, we have the duty to work towards and to create a world that honors the dignity of every human being, regardless of their race, their class, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their criminal history, their mental health, or their political ideology. That is our duty as human beings, as people who desire to build the beloved community. So this final point, this idea that the beloved community is achievable, then opens up to me a new question. How? How do we achieve this goal? How do we move from strangers and privilege to siblings and equity? So for wisdom here, I want to draw on the wisdom that I learned from Adrienne Marie Brown, a social justice facilitator, a healer, and a doula who lives in Chicago. She's the author of a book called Emergent Strategy: Shaping Change in Changing Worlds. And she says in this book, she draws a lot of wisdom from nature. And she says, how we are at the small scale is how we are at the large scale. What we practice at the small scale sets the patterns for the whole system. Transform yourself to transform the world, she says. That doesn't mean to get lost in the self, but rather to see our own lives and work and relationships as a front line, as a first place to practice justice, liberation, and alignment with each other and the planet. So that means that whenever it is tempting to get lost in the bigness of the work to which we have been called, one of the pieces of wisdom that I draw on is to get micro. When the macro becomes overwhelming, get micro. What does it mean to practice justice in your everyday life, in your encounters with everyday human beings? What does it mean to practice justice in the grocery store? What does it mean to practice justice in your home? What does it mean to practice justice in your church? How do those behaviors shape our sort of micro worlds as we work to shape the macro one? And this points again back to the beloved community definition that we heard from Dr. King, that this kind of world comes into being because people practice it. Specifically, he's talking about the practices of nonviolence, but it's a practice. We have to practice this new world into being. And so as a faith leader in the Episcopal tradition of Christianity, this then raises yet another question. If you haven't picked this up already, I love questions. How do our practices, individual and communal, shape us to be a part of this work. Now, there's one thing that we just have to admit. As Episcopalians specifically, this is one of the crosses that we must bear as people in the Episcopal Church, as a church that for many, many years sought to be the established church of this country. There are many ways in which our practices, prayer, baptism, and Eucharist can serve as a canopy, a sacred canopy for the status quo. Right? I'm considering the generations of Christians who could remember the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and at the same time participate in lynchings right outside the doors of their churches, and they never felt a sense of dissonance in that. I'm thinking about the people who could celebrate the new life and freedom given to us in baptism, while at the same time creating whole theologies and public policy that kept Black baptized people in chains even after their baptism. I'm thinking about the people who could pray to God for the blessings that they and their families enjoyed, all the while missing the reality that the God they were praying to is the God of the Exodus, who has no tolerance for injustice. If we are interested, moving from strangers to siblings and from privilege to equity, then it is time for us to do an audit of our practices. And dare I say, at the risk of heresy, that if our practices do not serve the well-being of humanity and the mission of God, then we need to question whether we need them at all. One of the unexpected gifts, if we can call it a gift, one of the unexpected gifts of COVID is that we have been disrupted in our normal, regular religious practice. The invitation in this moment is to think long and hard about whether what we are doing is serving the liberating move of the Spirit of God, or whether it is only serving to relax us into the status quo of non-anxiety, while sin, suffering, and injustice are being visited upon our neighbors. Friends, it is my belief, this is the good news of this, that it is my firm belief that at their heart, our Christian practices are disruptive. They are at their heart liberating. They are at their heart oriented towards God's justice. But our human tendency is to domesticate them, to turn them into adorable, Instagram-worthy celebrations, to make them markers of participation in polite and respectable society, to make them rote and obscure religious practices that provide us some bit of comfort and security in a highly destabilizing world. What I want you to hear in that is that I think there is a desire from a good place in some of the ways that we engage our practices, but I think that when we limit them to simply being means of comfort instead of means of liberation, when we cut ourselves off from the move of God in our world. There's a book I read about a year ago toward the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a book called The Day the Revolution Began, Reconsidering the Meaning of Jesus's Crucifixion. It's a book by New Testament scholar N.T. Wright. And in this book, N.T. Wright explores the layered meaning of the Jewish Passover and why it is that Jesus chose this particular festival, his final showdown, not merely with the Roman imperial authorities or with the corrupt Second Temple system, but with the powers of sin and evil. N.T. Wright calls the Passover, I love this phrase, a notoriously dangerous freedom festival. Because, he says, there is always something dangerous and disorienting to the powers that be when oppressed people get together to start singing about and imagining freedom. You can ask my enslaved ancestors who would steal away to Jesus and have their own freedom festival away from the prying eyes of their enslavers, that set the ground for their freedom, for the religious movement, for the social movement of our own age. Passover, if you will, celebrates God's showdown with the enslaving power of Pharaoh. But it isn't simply a historical commemoration. You see, for Jewish folks awaiting the messianic promise, the Passover is also a liturgy of hope. They pray that God will do it again. N.T. Wright writes that Passover says freedom now and kingdom now. And so when Jesus chooses the Passover as his moment of confrontation, he is reinterpreting this messianic hope in a new way. He is the Messiah sent by God to free the world from the debilitating, dehumanizing, and destructive powers of sin. And I like specifically when N.T. Wright says this. When Jesus wanted to explain to his followers what his forthcoming death was all about, he did not give them a theory, a model, a metaphor, or any other such thing. He gave them a meal. In other words, he gave them a practice, a Passover meal, or at least what they seemed to have thought was a Passover meal, though it turned out to be significantly different. He turned the meal around so that its primary significance looked forward to what was going to happen the next day. Jesus gives his followers a practice to invite them to share in the liberating work of God. So what does this mean but that the Eucharist, the weekly Christian festival of Passover, is a freedom festival? It may be comforting. It may be soothing. It may provide a sense of safety and security in the midst of a destabilizing world, but it should also be exhilarating. It should be challenging. It should also move us to imagine a world of justice because we are calling to mind and participating with the God who has taken on the powers of sin and injustice, who has already won that victory, and who has invited us to share in the implementation of that victory in our world at every level of our existence. I want to give you an example. Many, many years ago, right after I stepped into life as a new Episcopalian, I was also at the same time enrolled in seminary. And part of seminary education is something that we call CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. A lot of people will do their CPE unit in a hospital or a prison setting to learn how to be a chaplain in those kinds of settings. I chose to do my CPE with Church of the Common Ground, which is a ministry of the Diocese of Atlanta that worships and serves alongside folks who are in active and recovering addiction, struggling with mental health issues, who are dealing with poverty, hunger, homelessness, who have frequent run-ins with law enforcement. It is a scrappy, gritty community, and it is the community where I most came in close contact with God's work in the world. There is a priest in this community, but so much of the ministry of this church is done by the community. There is a weekly foot clinic where I learned that our neighbors who deal with homelessness oftentimes have chronic foot issues because they oftentimes have very little safe places to sit down. We learn these things when we're in relationships with people who are very different from us. But on Sundays, Church of the Common Ground worships outdoors every Sunday. Rain, sleet, snow, hail. If it's raining, if it's sleeting, there's an awning or a covering they put up, or they worship under a sort of a building, but they're outdoors every Sunday of the year. And part of their worship model is that they invite other churches from around to worship with them. And so a lot of churches will send groups, they'll send their youth groups, they'll send their outreach groups, they'll send their entire churches in some places. To worship with Church of the Common Ground. And the deal is they have to bring lunch, right? So they've got to bring lunch and share that lunch with the community. On this particular Sunday that I'm remembering, The vicar, Pastor Mary, was giving a sermon. And as she's giving her sermon in the middle of Woodruff Park, in the middle of downtown Atlanta, Georgia, she's accosted, verbally accosted, by a passerby who had an aversion to a woman being ordained. Pastor Mary continued to give her sermon completely unmoved, seemingly unaffected by this verbal sort of abuse that she was taking in that space. But one of the most vivid memories that I have of Church of the Common Ground was this particular Sunday when the bread was being broken in the middle of all the chaos that was happening in Woodruff Park. There was kind of a fight happening over here. The police were like whizzing down the street over here. There were sirens. There was a noise of the cityscape in the background. And in the midst of that, we're breaking bread and sharing Eucharist. Bread is broken further when the visiting congregation that day shared lunch with the members of Church of the Common Ground. And I saw in that moment the way in which our rituals, our ritual life, our Christian practices have the ability to bring us together in ways that are unmatched. I learned that while it might be the ritual norm for us to celebrate the Eucharist inside the rarefied atmosphere of our very beautiful churches, the true home of the Eucharist is among the chaos of the world. The Eucharistic fellowship might meet in a building, but if we aren't picking up on the liberating themes of our common life and carrying those themes out into the world, then we need to question the significance of what we're doing in the first place. To repeat, if we are interested in moving from strangers to siblings and from privilege to equity, we need to do an audit of our religious practices. And if our practices do not serve the well-being of humanity and the mission of God, then we need to question whether we need them at all. There are other places to find community. There are other places to participate in bizarre, bespoke religious practices. There are other places where we can support worthwhile charities in our communities. The church is called to a particular task of participating in God's just, merciful, righteous, joy-filled future, and everything about our common life points to this. How does the Eucharist alter and shape how we see community, who we see as our neighbor, who we invite into close relationship? Rachel Held Evans, in her book, Searching for Sunday, talks about the church as a close, flesh and blood, intimate encounter with one another. How does our Eucharistic practice shape who we see as our neighbor? How does baptism alter what we see as our purpose in our life? And when we are baptized, we live no longer for ourselves alone, but for him who died and rose again for us. And how does our life in prayer shape our concern for others? And when we teach people to pray, are we teaching them to pray for others or simply to pray for themselves? Is our life of prayer opening us up to the prayer of Jesus, who himself prays for the world? But this requires a radical shift in terms of what we expect as our religious experience. Once again, COVID gives us a gift in this, because our religious experience has been disrupted for at least a year. March 14th rather, next Sunday will mark a year since my congregation stopped worshiping in their building. We've been disrupted for a year. And while we have spent this year in grief and mourning, we've also spent this year questioning and wondering, how are we being changed? How is this an invitation to expect something different from the religious experience? Dare I say that comfort and safety and stability, while worthwhile, cannot be the cardinal virtues of Christian practice if we are desirous of participating in God's just future. We have to be open to be challenged. We have to be open to be uncomfortable. We have to be open to holy destabilization, because this is the only way that we ourselves can be made new as we participate in God's work of new making in the world. So I'd like to close with a thought from Rowan Williams in his book, Being Christian, Baptism, Bible, Eucharist, and Prayer. It's a book that I love to share with people because I think it's such a wonderful way of encapsulating the Christian life, particularly to people who are new to faith, who are new to the Christian faith. But I particularly love how Archbishop Rowan Williams talks about baptism. When I read this for the first time, this completely shifted my understanding of baptism. And so I want to share it with you. Where might you expect to find the baptized? One answer is in the neighborhood of chaos. It means that you might expect to find Christian people near to those places where humanity is most at risk, where humanity is most disordered, disfigured, and needy. Christians will be found in the neighborhood of Jesus, but Jesus is found in the neighborhood of human confusion and suffering, defenselessly alongside those in need. If being baptized is being led to where Jesus is, then being baptized is being led towards the chaos and the neediness of a humanity that has forgotten its own destiny. I'm going to repeat that last line again, because at that, there's a lot there to sink in. If being baptized is being led to where Jesus is, then being baptized is being led towards the chaos and the neediness of a humanity that has forgotten its own destiny. At their heart, our religious practices, our Christian practices, our communal practices, among other things, seek to build within us and in our communities the beloved community. What we need are new ways of practicing them that take our comfort and our safety out of the center, that asks God for ears to hear, for eyes to see, for minds and hearts to comprehend, and then asks God to give us shaking and trembling hands, willing to try on this way of life, even if we make mistakes, because it's called a practice, because it's not about getting it right, but it's about letting it transform us. Thank you.
Big sigh. Thank you. It's just taking in the substance, Marcus, of what you shared with us, to realize that faith, the practice of Christianity in our personal experience, is not merely a practice of comfort, but a practice of destabilization and encouragement. That is the forming of courage to live a different life. I couldn't help but think as you were reflecting with us about this morning's gospel lesson, taken from John. It's a bit about what I preached about, friends, but you know that what Jesus is talking about here at the beginning of John's gospel, and what John's hoping we'll see, is that this is going to transform our understanding of religion. Jesus was offering that to his community. I think you are encouraging us to hear it for ours. That Jesus is just as demanding to the Christian church and of the Christian church as he was of his community so long ago. So I really appreciate that. You know, Marcus, in our conversation, I hope I'm inviting this well. In our conversation, you spoke about how transformative the Eucharist was for you personally, and I think you're challenging us to think really critically. I mean, the thought of a spiritual audit of, if you will, to think personally and collectively on what this sacrament, and you went further, of course, but what this singular sacrament of the Eucharist really substantively means, beyond its personal comfort to us. That's certainly part of it, that wonderful awareness that Christ comes for me, that Christ fills and is present to me, but a challenging or an invitation to go beyond that. Yeah, I wonder for you, if you're so daring or willing. I shouldn't dare you. How has the Eucharist shaped you? What has that? How has the unpack that question with us, if you will. Help us see what it can be on a personal level.
Yeah, I mean, so in many ways, what you're asking is kind of what I feel and what I've come to sort of see as the quest of like the rest of my life, which is really trying to wrestle with that encounter, that moment. And that for me, one of the things that I've really come to see about the Eucharist is the way in which we are fed to feed, right? We receive to give. That Jesus invites us to dine with him in order that we might dine with others. When I was in Minnesota, the former bishop of Minnesota would oftentimes say, you are blessed to be a blessing, right? That there's sort of a continuity, there's an energy, there's a trajectory, a velocity rather to this work of faith. And so what I've come to see for me with the Eucharist is that the Eucharist consistently pushes me beyond myself. It consistently makes me think of others. It consistently, and particularly because I had that encounter at St. Martin's where I felt myself swept up into sort of this tradition, this spiritual tradition that I wasn't aware of before then. And then I had that encounter at Church of the Common Ground, where I was able to break bread in such a revolutionary way. One of the things that whenever Eucharist is done, there's there's that quiet time while, the acolytes or whoever's like cleaning up the altar and you're sort of setting the stage for the post-communion prayer. In that space, there's a prayer that I pray every Sunday that I've prayed for years. And it is, Lord, make me aware and bring me back to that space at St. Martin's and Church of the Common Ground. Let me never forget that experience. Because I never want to participate in the Eucharist in a way that simply makes it about me. While I am aware that there are many Sundays where I come in and I am spiritually hungry and I'm like, God, feed me. Like in the words of the hymn, bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. I'm also aware that feeding also, that to receive such a gift compels me to give such a gift. And so how am I then taking that desire to be fed out into the world? I was speaking to my spiritual director a few weeks ago, and we were just kind of talking about vocation and things of that nature. And somehow we sort of got on the question of what would you like to be the work of your life? Which, as a almost 35-year-old is such a, question. I'm only 35, but to think about what would you want people to know about your life? And I thought about that question for a while and then said, at the end of my life, I want it to be said that I fed people. in all the ways that you can take that phrase spiritually, emotionally, physically, fed people. And so for me, the Eucharist really has transformed how I see food, how I see dinner, how I see fellowship. All of that is really, really transformed by the Eucharist. And so when I talked about, wanting to host these pizza parties, it was because it's, I mean, there's pizza, which is a good enough reason to hold a party. um, but it is also because I'm deeply aware of the hunger for community, the hunger for belonging, the hunger for meaning, the hunger for relationships that exists in our world. That COVID has really pointed out and has like exacerbated, has underlined, has emphasized. There is a desire to be in relationship with people. And for me, the Eucharist points me towards that work. How am I embodying that work in the community where I live? How am I being a Eucharistic presence? To borrow from liturgical scholar Dom Gregory Dix, how am I being Homo Eucharisticus, the Eucharistic being? How am I living out the values of Eucharist in my daily life?
It challenges us. What you're sharing, and I think inviting us to do, is to look beyond the Eucharist as a practice of our community, but rather a practice or a discipline that shapes our community. That we might live, as you've just invited us, a Eucharistic life. And that demands that we not only experience the Eucharist technically, but that we explore it and experience it spiritually in its fullest, both nourishment but also challenge. I mean, it is one of the most radical things that Jesus does, not just at the Passover, but throughout his life, is to sit with the wrong people, if you will, to proclaim that this is who God is and who God loves. And so I'm really grateful for that reflection on your part. We're fortunate that this morning, I mentioned early on that we're fortunate to have a few responders in our midst. And I want to bring a couple of them in. The Galulis had said they were going to be able to join us, but something's come up and they're not able to be with us this morning. So I'm thankful that Betsy Creedon has stepped in with us this morning. So Betsy, thank you for joining us this morning. And Rima, it's great to have you with us. I saw Kansas early on. What happened? Where'd Kansas? I want to hear Kansas' response to this.